I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to our the second art exhibit of the new year, the new season, starting in 2016. Our first exhibition was the Prairie Lakes grant recipients. So this is our first one that features one artist. And the artist tonight is a little different tonight because the artist, this is more of a retrospective or a legacy kind of show because the artist passed away several years ago. His name was Daniel Kaniess, and I saw him in a movie by one of our Bethany students. I think it was a red-eye film. I saw him in a red-eye film, and that's it. But I saw his work at the Art World last year at St. John's Lutheran in northeast Minneapolis, and talking with his wife and his children, who are alumni of the college, I thought it would be a great idea for us to feature his work. Now, Daniel Kaniess would have been like a little brother by age to me because he was born a year later. And you can see his artwork is based on improvisation, experimentation. His logo was that it looks like it was made by a human. It has to be, the idea of it being made by a human is important. There's humor in the work also, and he seems to have no boundaries to what he is interested in, what he was investigating as an artist. Speaking on his behalf tonight is his daughter Kai, who was a recent graduate of Bethany, and so she will present his work and also answer questions if you have any after her lectures, her presentation. So please welcome Kai Kaniess.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. You are correct. I did graduate in 2010, so not too recently, but also not too far back. I do actually remember campus hasn't changed too much since I was here last. But I'm just going to launch right in. It's undoubtable that at this point this is not the first art lecture or speech that you've been subjected to. And of course, generally the person in front of you giving the speech is usually an artist, so thank you again for making the differentiation. But I do consider myself passionate about the subject. Maybe not the subject matter expert, but at the very least passionate. Let me explain a little bit in more detail. I knew the artist for 23 years of my life. I lived with the artist for 18 of those 23 years. I spent time in the artist's studio. I attended all of the artist shows. I talked with the artist about his art, and he also was my first art teacher. He was more than that, though, because he was my father, and I loved him. I can't speak as artist because I'm not him, but being surrounded by his art for my entire life and loving him to this day gives me the qualifications to stand before you now. The artist is not here because they've been a resident of heaven since April 2012 after a 5-year battle with colon cancer. We've done our best with the thoughts he left behind in writing to create the lecture which I will be presenting tonight. The artist wrote many grant proposals and artist statements over his career and left us with a wealth of his own thoughts to cull. He also did artist talks and also taught art theory at an art college in the Twin Cities. But of course, it only makes sense to start with a biography. Daniel Kaniess was born in Appleton, Wisconsin on November 9, 1955. The son of an ex-Marine high school teacher and a homemaker, he spent his early days enjoying the adventures that nature had to offer in his own backyard. This fostered a creative and an independent spirit. His days were spent down by the creek, in the woods, behind his house, accompanied by his brother, his dog, and a lunch pail packed by his mother. Dan attended a small Lutheran grade school and the local Lutheran high school. Although an art program was not offered, a teacher picked up on his raw, untrained talent, and Dan was encouraged to create high school preparatory art. Sports were always a big part of the small-town Wisconsin world. Working on posters and banners for teams gave him a way to be involved without always having to participate at a high school sports level, although he did play football and basketball during his high school career. This encouragement from his teacher also included the suggestion of becoming an artist as a full-time profession, the first time that this thought had been introduced in Dan's life. Based on that feedback, Dan attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and began the path to becoming a commercial artist. This plan was deterred when he didn't get into some of the classes required for the commercial art major because they were already full. He decided to take fine art courses to fill in his schedule and quickly found that intellectually this was where he truly belonged. The challenge was stimulating, and he connected with many of his professors. Dan participated in not just fine art, but also music, drama, and performance art. He truly enjoyed the intellectual discourse of artistic freedom. Dan still had to work hard to become an artist through his own force of will, since he had to work extra hard to keep up with his college classmates. This is because most of them had already started their formal art education during high school, but Dan did not have the same opportunity. However, he was used to working hard. With college out of the way in 1978, Dan's plan was to move to New York City to launch his art career. However, when housing plans fell through with a former university classmate in Manhattan, Dan found himself on his own in the Big Apple with too many people in the same current situation as him. In New York City, he saw a current copy of Art in America featuring red rooms in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Recognizing his own predicament and with all of his bags still packed, Dan realized that he could easily pick up and begin again in Minneapolis. Once settled in the Twin Cities, Dan's next objective was to find a job, and quickly. He spotted an ad in the paper for an art instructor and decided to follow up on it. Art Instruction Schools, located in Minneapolis, was the same company which advertised on matchbook settees, draw a Winky and win an art scholarship, with the image of a cartoon deer bearing resemblance to Bambi. The position required the grading of prospective students' work, but it truly was a sales scheme. This was the same art instruction school that Charles Schulz, creator of the Peanuts cartoons, had worked at. Dan ended up working with the actual people who had inspired some of the characters in the cartoon, and his personal favorite was the woman who had inspired the character Lucy. Next, he found work in art galleries while becoming established as a visual artist. The most notable gallery he worked for was called Nightwood and Brooks, which he ended up coining as Nitwit and Crooks, due to their dealing in fakes. At one point in time, they were investigated by the FBI for bringing in expertly crafted Rembrandt fakes. Eventually, they also dabbled in silver hoarding, which influenced the precious metals market unfairly. After that, he worked for a gallery run by a realtor who simply needed art for staging his houses. Working for these various galleries during the beginning of his career did not sit well with Dan. He didn't like shortcuts and believed in hard work to become successful. The 80s overall were a robust time in Dan's career. In 1980, he began having professional shows and began seeing a young woman named Sharon, who was at school at DMLC in New Ulm. Dan was also involved in the local and larger Midwest music scene, and the band 2I was conceived in 1981. The band was described as punk-funk music. More accurately, it wrote music with a jazz philosophy, but with rock instrumentation. Dan taught himself how to play electric guitar and brought his years of grade school trumpet playing to the stage. The band recorded and toured briefly over the next 5 years. Dan married the love of his life, Sharon, in summer of 1983. In 1984, Dan won first place in the Arts Center of Minnesota's juried exhibition. This award solidified Dan's efforts and provided motivation for his continued success. As life continued, Dan and Sharon started developing roots with a house purchased in 1987 and their first child, me, daughter Kai, born in 1989. In 1990, a son, Cab, was born. With children in the picture, Dan began the most important job of his life as a father. Being a stay-at-home dad gave him the opportunity of working on his art as well as developing his children by providing them with a structured yet infinitely creative environment day after day. Home life was not without hardships, as Dan's children inherited his genetic bone condition that brought about frequent pediatric surgeries and hospital stays. These surgeries cost both time and money, yet Dan did not let this inhibit his art career. The 90s seemed to be Dan's most successful decade yet, as he won the McKnight Fellowship in 1990 and 1996, and the Bush Fellowship in 1994. He had shows in New York City, Milwaukee, the Twin Cities, Rochester, Minnesota, Springfield, Ohio, and various college exhibits. His work was displayed frequently at local Twin Cities galleries such as Speedboat, Forum, Thompson, Montgomery Glasso, and Gus Lucky, sometimes participating with music performances as well. Dan also established himself on the burgeoning noise scene as poet in 1955. A review of Dan's art was published in the July 1995 issue of Art in America, the very magazine that had guided his migration to Minneapolis years prior. By the end of one millennium and the beginning of another, Dan had experienced the harshness of the changing economic climate, which was affecting the art world. He began to heavily reflect on art and its meaning, to not just him, but to society and the human condition. He continued to wrestle with the notion of the art industry, how it had changed along with the economy and the introduction of such technology as the internet. These themes are reflected in the inception of his own website, which is madebyhuman.com. In 2006, Daniel received the honor of participating in the Minnesota Artists Exhibition Program at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. At this time, Sharon and he were anticipating an empty nest where local music, vinyl collecting, and art would play a huge role in their daily lives. However, on September 27, 2007, Dan was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. As he faced his own mortality, Dan was motivated towards reflection. His main objective was to live life as strong and as dynamic as he could for as long as he could with his art, his music, and his family. He had various opportunities throughout 2011 to assist his son Cap with various films. Together they planned on filming an autobiography of Dan and his lifelong work. Dan began to set things in order but never set aside his art. He worked creatively in some way every single day. He stockpiled supplies, ready to use them the moment he felt up to creating art. He had as many ideas as he always had. Dan became more interested in current events and politics as they would affect the world left to his children. These elements were a part of his thought process and were evident throughout his work and the last conversations he had with his friends and his family. Like the artist Henri Matisse, who attached his paintbrush to a pole when he could no longer stand for long periods, Dan also used less physical means to create his art as his energy dictated. After only 3 weeks of hospice care at home, Dan Kaniess passed away on April 14, 2012, surrounded by his family. But of course we know the story doesn't end there. He leaves to us the legacy of visual art, music, poetry, thoughts, and feelings. A legacy that is mine to continue, and the legacy that was put before you today. Grief is a different process for everyone. As a family, part of our process was to catalog all the art that Dan left behind. The process of this was both magical and healing for our family. With each piece came a different memory or backstory. As we rediscovered all that remained, it became clear that it needed to be shared with the world. Although the artist was gone, the art remained. We put together the first retrospective show to take place on November 17, 2012 at the Northrop King Building in Northeast Minneapolis. In preparation, we not only selected iconic pieces that ranged his entire career, but also prepared the brief documentary that had been started before by Cab and Dan. The documentary mainly contained interviews with fellow artists and family members as they shared memories about both his life and his art. The one-night event was both overwhelming and surprising for us. There were bands who came and played covers of Dan's music, and there was a crowd with lines to get inside the venue, as well as lines to buy pieces of his work. I'm going to go into a little detail about influences of Dan's work now. It's hard to define the direct influence of his work without being able to ask him, but I am going to attempt to run through 3 movements, as well as individual artists that Dan drew influence from. Minimal art, where the work is set out to expose the essence, essentials, or identity of the subject through eliminating all non-essential forms, features, or concepts, was an influence of Dan's work. Artists would take abstraction to its logical conclusion by vacating representational subject matter entirely. Because of the tendency in minimal art to exclude the pictorial, illusionistic, and fictive in favor of the literal, there was a movement away from the painterly and towards sculptural concerns. Minimal sculptural art was also an influence. Non-objective sculpture is a more completely non-representational form that does not even have a starting point in nature. It arises from a constructive manipulation of the sculptor's generalized, abstract ideas of spatial relations, volume, line, color, texture, and so on. The approach of the non-objective sculptor has been likened to that of a composer of music who manipulates the elements of his art in a similar manner. German expressionists were also another influence. Since Dan's trend was a direct reaction against realism, this relates to practitioners of German expressionism, who used extreme distortions in expression to show an inner emotional reality rather than what is on the surface. Henri Matisse, who is responsible for significant developments in painting and sculpture, was also an influence of Dan's. His paintings expressed emotion with wild, often dissonant colors without regard for the subject's natural hue, and his mastery of the expressive language of color and drawing specifically spoke to Dan. Marcel Duchamp was another influence of Dan's. He had rejected the work of many of his fellow artists, like Matisse, as retinal art, intended to only please the eye. Instead, Duchamp wanted to put art back into the service of the mind. During this period, Duchamp's fascination with transition, change, movement, and distance became manifest. Ready-mades were found objects which Duchamp chose and presented as art. For instance, in 1913, Duchamp installed a bicycle wheel in his studio and called it art. However, the idea of ready-mades were not fully developed until 1915. The idea was to question the very notion of art and the adoration of art, which Duchamp found unnecessary. He challenged conventional thought about artistic processes and rejected the emerging art market through subversive anti-art. And as you probably have already learned in your classes, he famously dubbed a urinal as art and named it Fountain in 1917. Egon Schiele, a protege of Gustav Klimt and an early exponent of Expressionism, was also an influencer of Dan. Schiele is mostly remembered for the intensity of his figurative work, which include twisted body shapes and realism to the point of grotesque in the early 20th century. The post-impressionist painter and sculptor Alberto Giacometti was also a strong influence of Dan's because of his wish to create compositions with figures. Joseph Beuys, one of the most influential artists of the second half of the 20th century, was also a big influencer of Dan's work. Beuys was a performance, installation, and happening artist, as well as a sculptor, painter, and art theorist. He was most known for his social sculpturing and role in both art and political discourse. He inspired Dan to extend his definition of art to include the concept of social philosophy. Hans Hofmann, who was celebrated for his exuberant, color-filled canvases and renowned as an influential teacher for generations of artists, was also an influence of Dan's. Hofmann played a pivotal role in the development of abstract expressionism and is an important figure of post-war American art. Many would say that Dan also found inspiration in the works of Cy Twombly during his palimpsest phase. Like Dan, Twombly's works were usually large-scale and graffiti-like. Twombly was also an influencer of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who began with informal graffiti epigrams in the 1970s and progressed to neo-expressionist paintings by the 80s. Basquiat focused on suggestive dichotomies in his works and married text and image in a way that provided historical information mixed with a contemporary critique. Sharon, Dan's wife, absolutely fed off the intellectual conversations about the art and can also speak to Dan's influences. He was well-read and studied all through his career, always seeking knowledge and understanding about art, creativity, and expression. Used art books populated their home. At one point, the tower of stacked art books went from floor to ceiling. Regular visits to museums and other art shows fed his voracious curiosity. Human creativity is not actually creating something out of nothing, but is about creating something new from putting elements together in a new way. Dan's creativity wasn't just for visual artwork, but for all areas of his life. It was as if he could never turn it off. It wasn't coming from a capricious muse that arrived and left unannounced. Dan could focus on regular life and had the strength of responsibility and impulse control, but he was always carrying on creativity in his head as he did the dishes, laundry, or any other mundane task. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Dan's philosophy now. With regard to aesthetics, Dan said in his own words that Balancing my interests and my idea of beauty with materials that hold their own is an entertaining challenge. Art is often an improvisation that is driven by critical thinking, and each choice changes the playing field, not only for the work, but for the person as well. At the end of whatever creative process I undertake, my objective is that the result transcends the decisions I have made to suggest something greater to the audience. I strive to use the gifts God has given me to exact and meet thoughtful challenges. Dan wanted his art to be demonstrably human-made while still professionally polished. Photographic realism, though within his grasp, was not his goal. He wanted his figures to demonstrate the gestural movement of humanity, not the actual detail. Dan saw human interaction by the artist with materials in an era of technology as important. In his own words, while technological influences shape our perception, it is a challenge for the painter to put a human face on the change and establish a human prevalence. I intend that my artwork reflects human participation and that it be able to stimulate the senses that can so easily be numbed by the seduction of technological media. Composition was another theme of Dan's work. He said, in his own words, "When it comes to my drawing and painting, the end work is a record of the decisions to include or exclude visual information. The creative process is made up of decisions, musings, problems, and solutions." Whether working in the representational or abstract realm, Dan played with positive and negative space, endlessly balancing and experimenting with color, line, and shape. His decisions of what could be hidden or seen, shared or withheld, led to his complex palimpsest layering and hovering objects. A palimpsest is defined as something having unusually diverse layers or aspects apparent beneath the surface, and his palimpsest series visually represented this. Dan's compositions, which often included text, a mix of marked media and improvisation, bred his expressive art language. In his own words, "As individuals, we all have our own signature, and as a visual artist, I strive to cultivate the personality of my own work. I am suggesting some of the visual language of our contemporary landscape." How an artist shares the vision was on his mind as Dan analyzed framing and presentation. He explored inventive ways of hanging paintings as he mused about the dichotomy of the preciousness of archival work and the ephemeral nature of modernity. In his words, "The focus of an exhibition would be to direct an audience to become conscious of how they take in information today. As that is established, it would become understandable that art reflects this how in visual and intellectual ways. My work has been developed to make use of this means of seeing." I'm going to go into a little detail about Dan's process now. Dan's work ethic was evident to many. He was prolific, often working on many pieces at once. As the oils on one piece dried for a day or two, he began another, or worked on ink drawings and books, his poetry and text, or watercolors. Dan listened to music as he painted in the studio, and it was very, very loud. Hardcore music and punk music mixed with difficult jazz and noise music were his go-tos. Noise music is a genre that Dan participated in during this period of his painting. The music he listened to was often written on the back of his art pieces along with snatches of his own poetry. When newly married, his space for painting was the cramped second bedroom of a tiny walk-up apartment. Though it was small, he worked on many pieces here and began his successful rise in becoming known as the Twin Cities artist. When their house was purchased in 1987, his art studio became a side room off of the dining room. His first McKnight grant in 1990 allowed him to build an art studio over the kitchen of this century-old house. When awarded the Minnesota Artist Exhibition Program show at the Art Institute in 2006, he was finally able to rent a space outside the home to create the large billboard pieces for that show titled Energy Palimpsest. In the early 2000s, Dan decided to forego figure work to focus on purely non-objective work, which is for the most part on display here. The goal was to make the audience aware that the way we take in information today has changed our point of view. At the time, he pondered if our daily intake of internet content was affecting our perceptual and psychological awareness. He noted that attention spans were shrinking due to the high-speed glimpses that screen media technology gives us. While he didn't totally forsake the figure sneaking back in, he wanted to transcend the constraints of representational work when he wanted. He wanted to be able to walk down all paths of art without restraint. While this limited attention span and suspended perception may be useful for playing video games or double tapping on Instagram, it is culturally problematic. Dan's work responded to this perception change through his layered paintings and drawings on LP jackets and vast sections of Billboard vinyl, which obscure as much as they actually reveal. These 21st century palimpsests came to be not as a scarcity of materials, but through his desire to create and advance a visual language which links screen media aesthetic with the actual world. The resulting pieces alluded to many sources: graffiti, digital technology, contemporary graphic design, and computer animation, using the tools of our time: magic markers, paint markers, graffiti markers, and spray paint. He brought all over abstraction squarely into the 21st century through non-objective marks and forms that he drew, painted, and scribbled. There remains a nod to the gestural abstraction made famous by earlier greats such as Jackson Pollock, Hans Hofmann, and Cy Twombly, yet also a connection to a more contemporary and defiant street aesthetic that redraws commercial and perpetual boundaries. Instead of beginning with a blank canvas, Dan chose to create each piece on a plane of post-consumer material. The LP covers were easy to find at various thrift stores, as well as his own personal collection, but the vinyl billboards were a different story. Dan had the idea to reuse them because of the philosophic discussion about visual ephemera as well as cost. He knew they had enormous palimpsest potential, but obtaining them was a challenge. In order to obtain them, he spent many hours calling around advertising companies to determine who was responsible for the installation and confiscation of the vinyl. Once that had been determined, he would try to arrive at the same time as takedown to obtain the used vinyl sheets. In the defacing of post-consumer material, Dan employed a refreshing reverse logic, turning graffiti into restorative action. Dan's choice to deface commercial art material could be likened to Duchamp's painting of a mustache on the Mona Lisa, which happens to be one of the most commercialized art images in history. And while graffiti is always nearly viewed as a criminal act defacing property, it can also be viewed as a fundamental type of mark making, like cave drawings, that transcend the constraints of the marketplace. The method of animated gestures which cover each piece insists that we remember the artist in whose vanished footsteps we now stand. Dan said in his words, "I want the viewer to feel that the human being who authored this stood right here." Imagine Dan spinning the work as he painted, and you can begin to see the echo of his authorship entirely around each piece. So, what is the common theme? It is our belief that Dan was incredibly concerned with the kind of perceptual information space that we as a culture were venturing into 10 years ago. The gap between what we think we know and what we experience was also concerning. The world was changing back then, and it still continues to change each and every day. As an artist, Dan worked hard to put a human face on that change. He started his art career working hard and worked hard creatively until his last breath. He hoped that you would pay attention to his work because what you truly see and what you touch, whether it's creative, using, or consuming, really does make all the difference. Questions? And I may have to bring my beautiful associate Sharon up to the podium to answer them as well.
What did you say that he was an MAP?
2006.
Okay, I saw that show.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Can you point out the work that was in the Touche grant and also the work?
Those pieces are not here tonight, except I could say some of them might be because he reused a lot of canvases, so they might be an X-ray board.
Can you talk about what those bodies were?
Yes, a little bit. Now, first of all, the MAP show, the show at the Artist That's these big billboard vinyl pieces right over there. As far as the two McKnight shows and then the Bush.
Yeah.
The Bush. He worked on some specific figurative pieces and series. One of the shows, he did a complete wall of drawings and filled the whole wall with drawings. So he was working on specific pieces, installation pieces for those shows.
What the connection between the music and art? Can you explain a little bit?
His connection between his music and his art.
I might just give a description of a performance cab. You might want to correct me. But Soap Factory, do you remember that one? So Poet 1955, he liked to make a lot of experimental instruments. So the one that I mostly remember was, come on, you might be able to, I don't remember which it is, but we remember the same thing.
Yeah, so it was always weird coming home from school and finding these weird creations on the porch or in the studio or in the dining room kitchen. The one that Kai remembers is we had a tin, popcorn tins. There's a Wayne's World popcorn tin, and he froze a microphone in it with ice. And then one of the shows, which was at the Soapbox, he broke it open and had the microphone plugged in, and then there was another one where he had microphones in big wooden booths, and he kind of stomped around. A lot of odd, like trumpet-type instruments, horn-type instruments with like toilet tubing and other popcorn tins. So he had a lot of fun with that. There was a lot of reusing different materials. Like my mom said, he reused a lot of stuff. If he painted on wood, it sat around our house, not sat around, but we appreciated it at our house. After a year or two, he would chop it up and use it for something else, use it for an instrument, or an instrument became an art piece, or he gave it to us and had us draw on it, and then we would decorate it, and then he chopped it up and used it for a wrap for his records or something like that. So there was a lot of reusing with instruments, art, and life, I guess.
Do you think that, so with any piece that he made, was there potential to reuse it and chop it up? Like, it wasn't just little ones that he made at home, it was like anything he made, he could possibly paint over it or cut it up or have you guys play with it?
Yeah, I think there were probably certain pieces that he saw further future in showing, like a lot of the ones that were framed. He would either reuse the frames and roll up the art and save it for later, or he would reuse the canvas again. I remember there was one time we went to his parents' house in Wisconsin, my grandparents' house, and he had me film. It was a short video for another of his performances, he played music while he had the video showing, and the video was him. He had a whole portfolio of watercolors, and he made me film him burning them. And I didn't know what I was doing. He took me out, he's like, oh, I want you to hold this camera and film this. And I was like, oh, okay. And all of a sudden he started burning all this stuff, and I was like, I don't know what's going on. This is kind of scary, but he was very open to just starting over or using it for something else, and very open about that.
I remember being struck at a few of the shows, and I guess you could almost characterize it as sort of like industrial noise or something, but it had a very jazz like structure to it. So a lot of the sound was due to the instruments that he would use to create that kind of sound, and it was pretty interesting. It could be very loud.
Yeah,
Yeah.
loud, characterized.
Yeah, I think part of the connection to the question that was on the table, the music and the art, one of the connective pieces was the desire to destroy convention, and that's the improvisational nature of taking a theme and destructing it for the purposes of remaking it. And so the improvisational nature to the paintings. He never quite knew what he was going for in the painting, but he knew when it was done. And in the same way, we entered music, and I still do improvisational music, and you just start. Nobody asks what key they're in, or when we're going to end, how long this piece will be, whether it be fast or slow, loud or quiet. You just flow through it, and that was how we approached the visual art too. It's just allowing it to emerge and working with the problems as they came up.
Typically when someone loses a loved one, they have maybe a collection of photographs at home, a movie or two. And artists, I think, are motivated by the desire to leave something behind. You've obviously got a huge catalog of evidence and memorabilia, you might say. Did you find that is that helpful in the grieving process, or is it just, oh no, here's another one, and you go through grieving all over again?
That's a really good question.
Probably yes to both sides of it, but it's all of the paintings for myself personally as a wife were part of the family, and as things would get sold all through the years, I feel a loss because I love the painting and it left. So having the paintings here with us now after Dan has died is wonderful because there's so much story behind each piece. But it's emotional too. It takes energy to get all of this ready to go, but it's a good sort of loving energy. And Dan left us with a lot. And he was very prolific. He was also a voracious editor of his own work, so it's not like he kept everything as precious. He ruthlessly edited his catalog as to Kev's story. So things were always being reused, destroyed, destructed, painted over, and Dan only kept the things that he really liked, and yet we still have an awful lot of his work with us, and that's his mind that we still have with us, and that's wonderful.
About how many pieces are
I'd say about 500, and that includes items that are boxes of unframed.
We went through and started for the first retrospective show. We started going through and numbering things for easy reference, and it got to the point where we would just pull out a portfolio and look through all the pieces and then number the portfolio, because we can't number all of those pieces, and we can't, they don't all have names, they don't all have dates, we don't know what, they're just untitled 1 through 1,000 in this portfolio. It's a lot. It's fun to look at. It's like flipping through a comic book, but all different stories on each page. But a lot.
You speak a little bit to how the Lutheran boy from Wisconsin grows up to sort of be on the cutting edge of some modern art culture that is maybe considerably un-Christian.
They're not interested. The first thing he did when he went to college, first semester, is he grew his hair out. I think it was his strength of faith and confidence in the love of God that allowed him to delve into areas where many other Christians might have not wanted to go, knowing that it was okay and would be God-pleasing. As a Christian musician, for myself personally, I feel very, being on stage playing music is the highest praise that I have for God. But it's not in church, it's on a stage. somewhere else. And the same with the art world. Dan felt he wanted to take his Christianity into a place of real art as opposed to staying in a closed area. And he thought that was an important witness, and that he had the strength in God to do that. We can all do that.
I know you're both Bethany, right? So I know how Bethany or why Bethany is there, the reason that you both went here. And then also, I know you're a media arts major. What would be kind of?
Communications.
Okay. And are you doing things in art today? How your college, what's that do for you?
Yeah, well, as part, other than doing these, assisting with shows like this, I run Art World at St. John's Lutheran Church in Northeast Minneapolis. So that's my relation to the Art World right now. It's an annual event, and I play host, organize it, get the volunteers ready, annoy all the artists. Most of them come from Bethany, so they get annoyed every year by me. But that's kind of how I pay homage and do something in his honor every year. I always forget, I think it was him and Jason Jasperson were the first that were there, and I went, and even before that, before St. John's was doing it, we would go as a family every year, so it's important to me. Yeah, I play music, so I want to be involved in the events, and being able to do it through my church is even more awesome. So that's my current connection, but day-to-day in my job, I'm in software sales, so no art whatsoever. I guess my cube's decorated pretty nice, but...
Why did I come to Bethany? Because I went here. I'm a follower. No, it was, yeah, I follow her around, but it was just, seemed like a great place to foster what I wanted to do, let it grow, and that was pretty true. And I guess, it's one of the things that you take with you, what you learn in school and what you learn from, your parents. It's something that you take with you to your daily life, regardless of what you do, even if, you're sitting in a cubicle doing homework, which is fun. It's something that you think about and you take with you, like I said, whatever you do, and when you have free time, you're hanging out with friends, you're wanting to do what you love, and that's something that you learn here and with your parents and following your sister.
As a parent, I'll say one of the reasons why they came to Bethany was scholarships.